In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to debug a threaded application in Visual Studio.net. Now, you can use all the other ways of debugging applications like writing into the event log or creating a listener like we've showed in previous videos. But if you want to step through code, you're going to need to use the tools that Visual Studio has given you to step through multi-threaded applications. And I'm going to identify one of the biggest challenges whenever you're working with a multi-threaded app. And what I've done is just loaded back in the Threading02 project that I created in I think the second or third video in this series. And I'm not going to take time to explain it, but basically we're going to use the start multi-threaded functionality and set a breakpoint in one of the methods, worker, process, next, website, and I set a breakpoint on the for loop. So each of the threads that are created should start trying to execute this worker, process, next, website method, and we want them each to stop at this point, and then we're going to step through each of the threads. Now you might think to yourself already, how is it going to step through each line of code for each of the threads? And therein lies the challenge. So let's go ahead and run the application. Bring this down to a viewable area. Type in a word. Let's say we're looking for information on front page. Now I'm going to click Start Multi-Threads. And when we do, notice that we have a tab called Threads. It's similar to the watch or the locals that we might already be familiar with from previous videos. And notice that there's a list of all the threads that are used within our application. And not only their ID, but also their name. Now, we named our threads so we can identify them uniquely from the other threads that are running within the application. So the little yellow arrow shows that we are currently running thread number 1. So this line of code here is running on thread number 1. So I'm going to hit F11 on my keyboard to step into the application. And when I did, this stays on the same line. Well, why is that? Well, the reason is because if we look at this little yellow arrow, it says that now we're executing thread number 2. So that's the first lesson, is that you have to not only watch what line of code is executing in the code window, but also what thread is actually executing whenever you're working with a multi-threaded application. So I'm going to hit the F11 button on my keyboard one more time, and we pop back into the next line of code, but for thread number 1. And thread number 1 continues to execute the next line of code. Notice that thread 3 now has hit our breakpoint. So when its turn comes up, we jump back to this breakpoint for index equals 1 to 10. So you can see how this can get pretty hairy, and how are we supposed to tell what thread? I mean, it's very difficult as I begin to just step through. It just kind of jumps around. It doesn't seem to have an order. What we can do is specify 1 or 2 threads to work with at a time by one of a couple different methods. One, I'm going to select and right-click on the thread I want to execute. I'm going to select Switch to Thread, and when I do that, now it becomes the thread that I am working with. Of course, it jumped back down, so I'm going to have to do this again, Switch to Thread. So now it continues to operate, and meanwhile our other threads are continuing to execute behind the scenes, which can be a problem because I may want to check some concurrency issue between threads, and we'll talk about how to synchronize our threads, and this might become more of an issue at that point. So let me go ahead and just run the rest of the application because I'm going to need to start over anyway. Okay, let's go ahead and click choose a different word. Let's choose Flash MX and select Start Multi-Thread so we can start over again. So the one way to specify one thread is to right-click it and say Switch to Thread. The other way is to freeze the threads that we don't want to watch, which will make it a more linear way of watching a execution path of one of the threads, and hopefully that would help us determine if there were any bugs. And so I can select freeze a thread and then freeze. So I'm freezing threads 2 and 3. I'm going to hit F11, and now I'm going to need to freeze it again. Sometimes the freeze doesn't take for some reason, but now it seems to take, and every time I hit F11 it's only executing the code on thread number 1, and I'm looking at it in a very linear kind of way, step by step, as opposed to it jumping around between the other threads. So I'm going to hit F5 on my keyboard, and we'll see that every one of the results are processed on thread number 1. And if you recall from that the video that we did on this application before, we put the thread number in a parentheses next to the name of the website that's brought back. And so you can see each of these are on thread number 1, and it finally finishes in about a minute. Okay. Now let's do this again, but this time let's thaw out one of the threads after we have figured out what the problem is, and we want it to continue processing threads 2 and 3. So stop this and run it again. Make sure our breakpoint's still there. Good. And so this time let's pick the word Illustrator and click Start Multi-Threads. Okay, and we'll get all the threads here. I'm going to freeze thread 3 and thread 2, just like we did last time. And I'm going to have to refreeze another thread. Sometimes it takes a couple of times to do it for some reason. And so now we're only executing on thread 1. I'm going to right-click thread 2 and select Thaw. And so now it's only executing on threads 1 and 2, and 3 is still frozen. I'm going to hit F5 on my keyboard, and now we'll see that only threads 1 and 2 take on the bulk of the work. And they both finish. So that is how you thread or work with threaded applications in Visual Studio.net. I'd be remiss if I didn't point out one other small feature of Visual Studio in regards to threaded applications, and that is this. Let's go ahead and do this again and just type in blah and see if it brings anything back. It probably will. It's Google. Okay, so one of the ways we said, well, it's difficult to watch it skip around between threads, but notice this little toolbar that pops open whenever you're dealing with debugging in multi-threaded applications. You can see the current program and the main thread that it runs on, threading02.exe, is running on thread 3516. But then also you can see the current, the line of code that we're currently on right here. It's indicated by the little arrow here, but it's also indicated up here which thread we're currently on. In this case, we're on thread 3, executing now thread 2, executing thread 3, and so we can monitor it that way, and we can also switch to threads in a similar manner to see what's going on. And that's the equivalent of just right-clicking and selecting switch to thread. So again, this is if you're having problems with an application, you can't figure out where the problem is, and you may even have a problem between two threads trying to access the same piece of information. We're going to talk about synchronization in the next couple of videos. Then you'll need this type of functionality where you can switch back and forth between the threads and watch what they're doing. So thank you.